The heat that hid their cries. When rancher Evan Cole hears faint cries coming from an abandoned barn on New Year's Eve, he discovers 9 starving children left to die in the brutal summer heat. One choice will shatter his decade of isolation and force him to become the father he thought he'd lost the right to be. If you're ready for a story about second chances, found family, and love that refuses to break, stay with me until the very end. And when you do, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The sky over Wyoming hung low and colorless, pressed down by heat that hadn't broken in 43 days. The summer of 1889 had turned vicious in a way the old-timers said they'd never seen. Crops withered before they flowered, cattle stood motionless in what little shade they could find, and even the wind had given up, leaving the air thick and still as something you could drown in. Evan Cole rode his mare across the northern pasture as the sun bled orange into the horizon, his hat pulled low against the glare that still burned even as evening approached. Somewhere to the south, fireworks popped and crackled, distant towns celebrating the new year indoors where the heat couldn't reach them. Out here, there was no celebration, just dust, just silence, just the rhythm of hooves against ground so dry it had cracked open like old leather. He'd ridden this land for over a decade, every fence line, every gully, every forgotten corner. He knew the placement of every rock, the slant of every hill, and he knew the East Barn, what was left of it, sat a half-mile out, its roof sagging, its walls warped by years of neglect. He hadn't been out that way in months. There was no reason to go. Nothing lived there anymore. But tonight, something pulled him in that direction. Not instinct exactly. Not duty. Just a restlessness he couldn't name. The kind that settled into a man's bones when he'd spent too many years alone with his own thoughts. The barn appeared through the haze like a skeleton, its frame barely holding together, half collapsed on one side where a winter storm had torn through years ago. Evan slowed his mare to a walk, squinting at the structure as if seeing it for the first time. The door hung crooked on a single hinge. The windows, what few remained, were fogged with grime and spiderwebs. And then he heard it. Faint. Fragile. A sound that didn't belong. Crying. Evan pulled the mare to a stop, every muscle in his body going still. He listened, his breath shallow, the world around him holding its breath with him. There it was again, weak, desperate, barely more than a whisper carried on air that refused to move. He dismounted slowly, boots hitting the ground with a muffled thud. His hand went instinctively to the rifle strapped to his saddle, then dropped. This wasn't the sound of danger. This was something else, something worse. He approached the barn carefully, every step deliberate, his shadow stretching long and thin across the cracked earth. The door groaned as he pushed it open, the sound scraping against the silence like nails on stone. The heat inside hit him like a fist, thick, suffocating, laced with the stench of sweat and sickness, and something foul he didn't want to name. He stepped inside, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through gaps in the walls. And then he saw them. 9 children, huddled together in the far corner, pressed against the wall as if trying to disappear into it. Their faces were gaunt, hollowed out by hunger and heat, their lips cracked and bleeding, their skin burned red and peeling from the sun that had poured through the broken roof all day. The youngest couldn't have been more than 3. The oldest, maybe 10, maybe 12. It was hard to tell beneath the dirt and exhaustion, sat with her arms wrapped around the smaller ones, her eyes wide and glassy, staring at him like he was something she'd stopped believing in. Evan froze. His mind went blank, then flooded all at once with questions that had no answers. Who? His voice came out rough, broken. He swallowed, tried again. Who left you here? The oldest girl didn't answer. She just stared, her body trembling despite the heat, her arms tightening around the children pressed against her. Evan took a step closer, then stopped when she flinched. He held up his hands, palms out, the way you'd approach a wounded animal. I'm not going to hurt you. Still nothing. Just those eyes, watching him with a fear so deep it had burned itself into something else entirely. He crouched down slowly, lowering himself to her level, his knees protesting the movement. How long have you been here? The girl's mouth opened, closed, opened again. When she finally spoke, her voice was so faint he almost didn't hear it. 3 days. The words hit him harder than the heat. 3 days. In this barn. In this hell. Where are your folks? Her eyes dropped to the floor. Gone. Gone where? Just gone. Her voice cracked on the word, and she pressed her face into the shoulder of the child beside her. A boy, maybe 6, his breathing shallow and uneven. Evan looked at the others. A little girl with tangled black hair clutched a rag doll with no face. 2 boys sat slumped against each other, their eyes half closed, too weak to sit upright on their own. A toddler lay curled in the oldest girl's lap, motionless except for the faint rise and fall of his chest. "What about family?" Evan asked, his voice steadier now, though his hands were shaking. "Somebody's got to be looking for you." The girl's jaw tightened. "Uncle came, took what was left, said we were a burden, said nobody wanted us." She paused, her voice dropping to something barely audible. "Towns turned us away, said they had enough mouths to feed." Evan's chest tightened. He stood slowly, his shadow falling over them, and for a moment he saw himself through their eyes, just another man, another person who might walk away. He turned toward the door, and the oldest girl made a sound, small, choked, like she'd expected this all along. Evan stopped. The new year was 2 hours away. Fireworks still echoed faintly in the distance, celebration for people who had something worth celebrating. Out here, there was just heat, just dust, just 9 children who'd been left to die because no one wanted the weight of caring for them. He'd spent a decade building walls around himself, keeping the world at arm's length, letting grief and guilt carve out a space so deep nothing could reach him. It had been easier that way, safer. He didn't have to feel, didn't have to fail. But standing in that barn, surrounded by hollow eyes and broken bodies, he felt something crack open inside him, something he'd thought had died years ago. He turned back around. "Can you walk?" The girl blinked, her expression caught somewhere between disbelief and terror. "Can you walk?" he repeated, softer this time. She nodded, barely. "Then get up. All of you who can stand, get up." For a long moment, no one moved. Then the oldest girl shifted, slowly easing the toddler off her lap and onto the floor beside her. She rose on shaking legs, her hand gripping the wall for balance. One by one, the others followed, stumbling, swaying, clinging to each other for support. Evan moved among them, lifting the youngest ones into his arms, his voice low and steady. "We're leaving, right now." "Where?" the girl whispered. "My ranch. It's not far." "Why?" The question stopped him. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the same exhaustion he'd carried for years, the same quiet certainty that the world had already decided what she was worth. "Because you're still breathing," he said simply, "and that's enough." He carried 3 of the smallest children outside, settling them carefully onto his mare before returning for the others. The oldest girl walked beside him, her steps unsteady, her hand hovering near his arm, as if she didn't quite trust he was real. The ranch was a 20-minute ride under normal circumstances. Tonight, it took twice that. Evan walked the entire way, leading the mare slowly, the children clinging to the saddle, to each other, to the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't another trick. When the ranch came into view, lit faintly by lantern light spilling through the windows, Evan felt the weight of what he'd just done settle over him like a stone. 9 children. He didn't have 9 beds, he didn't have 9 plates. He barely had the emotional capacity to take care of himself, let alone a house full of broken, starving kids who'd been taught the world didn't want them. But he'd made the choice, and Evan Cole didn't go back on his word. He carried them inside one by one, settling them on the floor near the stove where the air was cooler. He fetched water, cool, clean water from the well, and watched as they drank too fast, coughing and gasping, their bodies remembering what it felt like to be alive. He sliced bread, boiled potatoes, heated broth. He moved through the kitchen like a man in a dream, his hands steady even as his mind raced. The oldest girl sat near the window, watching him with those same hollow eyes. "What's your name?" Evan asked quietly. "Clara." "Clara." He nodded, committing it to memory. "I'm Evan." She didn't respond, just watched as he set a bowl of broth in front of her, steam rising in lazy curls. "You don't have to trust me yet," he said, "but you're safe here. That's a promise." Clara stared at the bowl for a long time. Then, slowly, she picked it up and drank. Evan turned away, his throat tight, his eyes burning. He didn't know what came next, didn't know how to fix this, but for the first time in a decade, he felt something other than emptiness. He felt responsible, and that terrified him more than anything. The first night was chaos. Evan had no system, no plan, no idea what children needed beyond food and water. He laid out every blanket he owned across the floor of the main room, creating a patchwork nest near the stove. The children collapsed into it without hesitation, their bodies folding into sleep so fast it was almost frightening. All except Clara. She sat upright near the edge of the blankets, her back against the wall, her eyes fixed on the door. Evan watched her from the kitchen table, his own exhaustion pressing down on him like a weight he couldn't shake. "You should sleep," he said. "Someone has to watch." "Watch for what?" She didn't answer, just kept staring at the door, her jaw set, her hands clenched in her lap. Evan sighed, pushing himself up from the chair. He crossed the room slowly, lowering himself to the floor a few feet away from her, close enough to talk, far enough to give her space. "I meant what I said," he told her quietly. "You're safe here." Clara's eyes flicked toward him, then away. "People say a lot of things. I'm not people. You're a stranger. So are you." He leaned his head back against the wall, his voice softening. "But we're going to have to figure this out together. Because come morning, those kids are going to wake up, and they're going to need more than I know how to give." Clara's jaw tightened. "You don't have to keep us." "I know." "Then why did you?" Evan was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw, stripped of everything but the truth. "Because nobody should die alone in a barn." Clara's eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. She just nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible movement, and turned her gaze back to the door. They sat in silence as the night stretched on, the heat refusing to break, the air heavy and still. Somewhere in the distance, fireworks burst one final time, marking the end of one year and the beginning of another. Evan didn't know what the new year would bring, didn't know if he was strong enough, good enough, to do what these children needed. But as the youngest boy shifted in his sleep, curling closer to Clara, his small hand reaching out to grip her sleeve, Evan made a silent vow. He wouldn't let them down. Not this time. Not ever again. Morning came with a vengeance. The heat hadn't broken. If anything, it had intensified, settling over the ranch like a suffocating blanket. Evan woke to the sound of coughing, harsh, rattling coughs that echoed through the house. He shot upright, his body protesting the movement, and found Clara kneeling beside one of the younger boys, her hand pressed to his forehead. "He's burning up," she said, her voice tight with panic. Evan crossed the room in 3 strides, dropping to his knees beside them. The boy's skin was flushed, slick with sweat, his breathing shallow and uneven. Heat sickness, dehydration, maybe worse. "Get me cold water," Evan said, his voice calm despite the fear clawing at his chest. "And rags, as many as you can find." Clara moved fast, her bare feet slapping against the wooden floor. Evan stripped the boy's shirt off, exposing skin that was red and blistered in places, pale and clammy in others. He'd seen this before, seen men drop in the fields, seen animals succumb to heat that wouldn't quit. Clara returned with a bucket of water and a handful of torn cloth. Evan soaked the rags, wringing them out before draping them across the boy's chest, his neck, his forehead. "Talk to me," Evan said quietly, his hands never stopping. "What's his name?" "Thomas." "How old?" 6, maybe 7. I'm not sure." Evan nodded, his jaw tight. He kept working, changing the rags as they warmed, pouring small sips of water between the boy's cracked lips. Clara stayed beside him, her hands mimicking his movements, her face pale but focused. It took 2 hours before Thomas's breathing evened out, before the fever broke enough for him to open his eyes. "Hey there," Evan said softly, offering a small smile. "You're okay. You're safe." Thomas stared at him with wide, uncertain eyes. Then his gaze shifted to Clara, and something in him seemed to settle. He reached for her hand, and she took it, squeezing gently. Evan sat back on his heels, exhaustion crashing over him. He looked around the room, at the 8 other children still sleeping, at the blankets soaked with sweat, at the meager supplies he'd pulled from the pantry. This was just the beginning, and he had no idea how he was going to survive it. By midday, the house was a different kind of chaos. The children woke slowly, one by one, their movements cautious, their eyes scanning the room as if expecting the barn to reappear around them. Evan moved among them, offering water, bread, soft words that felt clumsy on his tongue. He wasn't good at this. Wasn't good at softness, at comfort, at knowing what to say to children who'd been abandoned by everyone who was supposed to protect them. But he tried. He learned their names. Clara, the oldest at 12. Thomas, still weak but sitting upright now. Lily, who clutched her faceless doll and hadn't spoken a word since waking. The twins, Jacob and Samuel, who stayed glued to each other's side, their identical brown eyes watching everything with quiet intensity. Annie, who couldn't have been more than 4, her thumb planted firmly in her mouth. Peter, gangly and awkward at 10, his hands too big for his body. Ruth, 8 years old with a scar above her left eyebrow. And the youngest, Michael, 3 years old, who cried softly whenever anyone tried to set him down. 9 names, 9 faces, 9 lives that had been thrown into his hands without warning. Evan set them to small tasks, folding blankets, carrying cups to the kitchen, sitting in the shade on the porch. Not because the work needed doing, but because he could see the fear in their eyes every time they sat still for too long. Fear that this was temporary, fear that the moment they let their guard down, it would all be ripped away. Clara helped without being asked, her movements efficient and careful, always positioning herself between the younger children and the door. She didn't smile, didn't relax, just worked, her shoulders tense, her gaze flicking toward Evan every few minutes as if checking to see if he was still there. "You don't have to do all that," Evan said quietly, nodding toward the stack of dishes she'd started washing. "Someone has to. I can handle it. So can I." He didn't argue, just stood beside her, drying the dishes she handed him, the silence between them heavy but not unkind. "Where'd you come from?" he asked after a while. "Before the barn." Clara's hand stilled in the water. "Kansas, then Nebraska, then here." "Your folks?" "Dead. Fever took Ma 2 years ago. Pa lasted 6 months after that. Said he couldn't do it without her." Her voice was flat, matter of fact, like she was reciting a list. "Uncle tried for a while. Then he didn't." "And the others?" "Different places, different stories. All the same ending." She pulled her hands from the water, drying them on her skirt. "We're the ones nobody wanted." Evan set the dish down carefully, turning to face her. "That's not true." Clara's eyes met his, sharp and unyielding. "Isn't it?" He didn't have an answer for that, not one that would mean anything to a girl who'd already learned the world's cruelest lesson. So he just nodded toward the main room, where the younger children were starting to gather near the windows, drawn by the faint breeze that had finally started to stir. "Maybe it was true," he said quietly, "but it's not anymore." Clara studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she turned back to the dishes without a word. But the heat didn't break that day. Or the next. Or the next. For a week the ranch existed in a strange, suspended kind of stillness, cut off from town by roads too dangerous to travel, too hot to risk. Evan rationed water carefully, praying the well wouldn't run dry. He stretched meals as far as they'd go, watching the children eat with a hunger that went deeper than their stomachs. Slowly, tentatively, the house began to shift. Lily started humming, soft, wordless tunes that filled the quiet corners. The twins ventured outside, exploring the barn, the chicken coop, the fence line, always together, always within shouting distance. Peter asked if he could help with the horses, his voice uncertain, his hands gentle, despite their size. Ruth organized the younger ones into games that involved more laughing than rules, and Clara began to let her guard down. Just a fraction, just enough. Evan caught her smiling once, a brief, fleeting thing that vanished the moment she realized he'd seen it. But it had been there, and that was enough. He didn't push, didn't ask for more than they were ready to give. He just showed up. Every morning, every evening, every moment in between. He was there, and slowly, impossibly, they started to believe it. On the 8th day, the man came. Evan was in the barn, checking on the mare, when he heard the sound of hooves approaching fast. He stepped outside, shading his eyes against the sun, and saw a rider coming up the road, dust billowing behind him, his posture tense and aggressive. Evan's hand drifted toward the rifle leaning against the barn wall. The man dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, his boots hitting the ground hard. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face weathered and mean. Evan recognized the type, the kind of man who took what he wanted and justified it however he needed to. "You Evan Cole?" the man barked. "I am." "You got something that belongs to me." Evan's jaw tightened. "I don't think I do." The man's eyes narrowed. 9 kids. My niece and her strays. I'm here to collect." From the house, Evan heard the sound of the door opening. He didn't turn, but he knew Clara was standing there, watching. "Those children aren't yours," Evan said, his voice low and steady. "They're family. That makes them mine. Family doesn't leave kids to die in a barn." The man's face flushed red. "You don't know what you're talking about. Those kids are a burden, mouths to feed, trouble to manage. I did what I had to. You left them to die. I left them to be found. And now I'm taking them back." Evan stepped forward, his body a wall between the man and the house. "No, you're not." The man's hand moved toward the gun at his hip. Evan didn't flinch. "You draw that, and you won't leave here standing." For a long, tense moment, neither man moved. The air crackled with heat and fury, the world holding its breath. Then the man spat into the dust at Evan's feet. "You'll regret this." "Maybe," Evan said, "but they won't." The man glared at him, his chest heaving. Then he turned, mounting his horse with a vicious jerk of the reins. He rode off without another word, his shadow stretching long and dark across the ground. Evan didn't move until the dust had settled. Then he turned slowly, his eyes finding Clara standing in the doorway, her face pale, her arms wrapped around the younger children crowding behind her. "He's gone," Evan said quietly. Clara's voice was barely a whisper. "He'll come back. Let him." She stared at him, her eyes wide, searching. "You don't know what he's like." "I know what I'm like." Evan's voice was firm, unyielding. "And I'm not letting him take you." For the first time since they'd met, Clara's face crumpled. She pressed a hand to her mouth, her shoulders shaking, and Evan crossed the distance between them in 3 strides. He didn't touch her, didn't know if she'd want that, but he stood close, solid, present. "You're safe," he said again. "All of you. That's a promise." And this time, Clara believed him. The days that followed the man's visit carried a different weight. The heat still pressed down relentless and unforgiving, but inside the ranch house, something had shifted, a tension that coiled tight beneath every conversation, every shared meal, every moment of quiet. The children felt it. Evan saw it in the way they startled at unexpected sounds, the way Clara positioned herself near the windows with increasing frequency, her eyes scanning the horizon like she was waiting for something inevitable. Evan didn't tell them about the sleepless nights he spent on the porch, rifle across his lap, watching the road. Didn't mention the way his gut twisted every time he heard hooves in the distance, even when they passed by without slowing. He just kept showing up, kept the routine steady, kept his promises visible. 3 days after the confrontation, Clara found him in the barn before dawn, mucking out stalls in the half-light that preceded sunrise. "You don't sleep much," she said from the doorway. Evan glanced up, his hands stilling on the pitchfork. "Neither do you." She stepped inside, her bare feet silent on the dirt floor, her arms wrapped around herself despite the warmth already building in the air. "I keep thinking he's going to come back, in the middle of the night, when we're not ready." "He might." Clara's eyes widened slightly. Most adults would have lied, would have offered false comfort. Evan just stood there, honest and unflinching. "If he does," Evan continued, setting the pitchfork aside, "he's going to find me waiting, and he's going to leave empty-handed, same as before. You can't fight him forever. Don't need forever, just need long enough. Long enough for what? Evan wiped his hands on his pants, considering his words carefully. Long enough to make this legal. Long enough to make sure no judge in Wyoming would hand you back to a man who tried to kill you. Clara's breath caught. You're going to try to keep us? Not try. Am. He met her eyes, his voice steady as bedrock. But I need your help. I need to know everything. Where you came from, what happened before the barn, names of anyone who might have claim. Truth, Clara. All of it. She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers twisting in the fabric of her dress. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. My pa was Robert Brennan. Died in Nebraska, winter of '87. Uncle Silas, the man who came here, he's pa's brother, took us in because the town said he had to. But he didn't want us. Never did. She paused, swallowing hard. The others, they're not blood. Not to me, not to him. Thomas and Lily, their ma died in childbirth. Father brought them to our door and never came back. The twins, Jacob and Samuel, their folks got cholera. Peter's father was a drunk who beat him, so Peter ran. Ruth's family died in a fire. Annie and Michael, we found them at a church in Kansas. Someone just left them there with a note pinned to Annie's dress. And your uncle took them all in? Clara's laugh was bitter. He collected the charity money the county gave for orphans, kept it all, fed us scraps, worked us like animals. Her voice hardened. When the money ran out, he decided we weren't worth the trouble. Evan's jaw clenched so tight it ached. The barn. That was intentional. He told us to wait there, said someone was coming to take us to a new home. We waited 3 days. Her eyes glistened, but her voice didn't waver. Nobody came. Nobody was ever going to come. Evan was silent, fury and grief warring in his chest. After a moment, he crossed to where Clara stood and lowered himself to one knee so they were eye level. I'm making you a promise right now, he said quietly. Silas Brennan will never touch you again. Any of you. I don't care what the law says, what judges decide, what papers get filed. You're under my protection now, you understand? Clara nodded, a single tear sliding down her cheek. Good. Evan stood, his resolve settling into something unshakable. Now, let's figure out how to make it stick. By mid-morning, Evan had hitched the wagon and was preparing for the ride into town. The heat had finally broken enough to make travel possible, though the roads would still be treacherous, dust so thick it choked, ruts deep enough to snap an axle if you weren't careful. Clara stood on the porch. The other children gathered behind her like a living wall of worry. How long will you be gone? She asked. Long as it takes. Could be all day. Evan adjusted the reins, his movements deliberate. You remember what I showed you? Clara nodded toward the rifle propped just inside the doorway. Stay inside, lock the doors. Anyone comes, I fire a warning shot. And if they don't leave? I aim to wound. Her voice was calm, factual. Evan had spent the past 2 days teaching her to shoot, and she'd learned fast, too fast maybe for a 12-year-old girl. But these weren't normal circumstances. You won't need it, Evan said, though they both knew he couldn't promise that. But I'm glad you know how. Peter stepped forward, his gangly frame trying to pull itself taller. I can help. I'm strong enough. I know you are, Evan said, and meant it. That's why I need you here. Clara's in charge, but you're her second. Anything happens, anything at all, you keep these kids safe. Can you do that? Peter's chest swelled slightly. Yes, sir. Good man? Evan climbed onto the wagon, gathering the reins. He looked at each of them, 9 faces watching him with a mixture of fear and trust that made his chest tight. I'll be back before dark. You have my word. He urged the horses forward and didn't let himself look back. The ride into town took 3 hours through heat that shimmered off the road in visible waves. Evan's shirt was soaked through with sweat by the time the buildings of Clearwater came into view. A scattered collection of storefronts, a church, a saloon, and the county office that doubled as the sheriff's post. Evan tied the horses outside the county office and stepped into the relative cool of the building's interior. Behind a desk cluttered with papers sat Marshal Frank Cord, a man in his 50s with silver threading through his dark hair and eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything. "Evan Cole," Frank said, leaning back in his chair. "Been a while." "Frank, what brings you to town? Heard you've been keeping to yourself out at that ranch." Evan removed his hat, turning it in his hands. "I need to file paperwork. Legal guardianship." Frank's eyebrows rose. "Guardianship? For who?" "9 children, ages 3 to 12. The marshal's chair came down hard, all 4 legs hitting the floor. "9? Where the hell did you get 9 children?" "Found them, abandoned in my east barn, near dead from heat and starvation." Frank's expression darkened. "Abandoned by who?" "Man named Silas Brennan. He's the uncle to one of them, but he took in the rest for county money. When that dried up, he decided they weren't worth feeding." Silas Brennan. Frank pulled a ledger from his desk, flipping through pages. "Yeah, I got records of him collecting orphan support out of Kansas and Nebraska. Moved around a lot, always just ahead of questions." He looked up, his eyes sharp. "You got proof he abandoned them?" "I got 9 starving kids and a barn he left them in to die." "That proof enough?" Frank drummed his fingers on the desk. "It's enough to investigate, not enough to prosecute without testimony. And getting kids to testify against family?" He trailed off, shaking his head. "He came to my ranch 3 days ago, tried to take them back." "What'd you do?" "Sent him away." "He leave peaceful?" "Eventually." Frank sighed, rubbing his temples. "Evan, I understand what you're trying to do here. And if those kids were abandoned the way you say, then Silas Brennan deserves to hang. But the law's complicated when it comes to family. Blood relatives got rights, even bad ones. Not over children they tried to murder. In the eyes of the law, he'll say he left them somewhere safe and expected them to be found. He'll say he had intentions of coming back. He'll make it messy, and messy cases take time." Evan's hands tightened on his hat. "How much time?" "Months. Maybe longer. You'd need a judge to terminate his parental rights, and that means hearings, testimony, proof of unfitness beyond a reasonable doubt." "Those kids don't have months. They've already been through hell." "I know." Frank's voice softened. "But if you want to do this right, you've got to follow the process. Otherwise, Brennan could show up with a county order and the law on his side, and I'd have no choice but to enforce it." Evan was silent for a long moment, his mind working through options, angles, possibilities. Finally, he looked up. "What if we started the process now, filed the petition, got it on record? Would that give me any standing if he came back?" "It'd show intent. Might convince a judge to issue a temporary order placing the children in your care pending investigation. But Evan..." Frank leaned forward, his expression serious. "You ready for this? Taking in 9 kids isn't like taking in a stray dog. It's permanent. It's overwhelming. It's going to change everything about your life." "It already has." Frank studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, let's get the paperwork started." They spent the next 2 hours going through forms, records, statements. Evan provided every detail he could remember: names, approximate ages, the condition he'd found them in, Silas Brennan's visit, and threats. Frank took notes in careful, methodical handwriting, occasionally asking clarifying questions. "You got means to support them?" Frank asked. "Judge is going to want to know you can provide." "Ranch turns a profit, not a fortune, but enough. I've got livestock, crops, a sturdy house. They won't go hungry." "What about schooling?" Evan paused. He hadn't thought that far ahead. "There a school in Clearwater?" "Schoolhouse on the east side. Teacher's name is Miss Adelaide Winters. She's good, but she's got her hands full with 20 students already. 9 more might be a stretch. I'll talk to her." Frank made another note. "You're going to need character witnesses, people who can vouch that you're fit to raise children." Evan's stomach sank. He'd lived alone for over a decade, kept to himself, avoided town except when necessary. He didn't have friends, didn't have community, didn't have anyone who could stand up and say he was worth trusting with 9 young lives. "I don't know that I have anyone," he admitted quietly. Frank set down his pen, his expression thoughtful. "You got me." Evan looked up sharply. "I've known you 15 years, Evan. Known you since you first came to Wyoming with your wife, and..." He stopped, cleared his throat. I know you're a good man. Know you've been through loss that would have broken most people. And I know if you're doing this, it's because you believe it's right. He extended his hand across the desk. I'll testify on your behalf. That enough to start? Evan gripped his hand, his throat tight. More than enough. They finished the paperwork as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Frank promised to file the petition first thing in the morning and said he'd send word when a hearing date was set. One more thing, Evan said as he stood to leave. If Silas Brennan shows up in town asking questions, I want to know about it. You think he will? I think he's not done. And I think he's the kind of man who doesn't like being told no. Frank nodded grimly. I'll keep my ears open. You watch your back out there. Evan left the office and stopped at the general store on his way out of town, using money he couldn't really spare to buy fabric for clothes, extra flour and sugar, a slate and chalk for lessons. The storekeeper, a thin woman named Mrs. Halstead, eyed him curiously as she tallied his purchases. Heard you got some children staying with you, she said, her tone carefully neutral. News traveled fast in small towns. Evan kept his expression calm. That's right. How many? 9. Her eyebrows climbed. 9? My goodness, that's quite a household. It is. She wrapped his purchases in brown paper, her movements efficient. Well, if you need anything, clothes, supplies, advice, you just let me know. Raising children is no small task, especially that many. Evan detected no judgment in her voice, just practical concern. He nodded. I appreciate that, ma'am. She handed him the packages, then paused. Mr. Cole? Those children are lucky to have found you. He didn't know how to respond to that, so he just tipped his hat and left. The ride back to the ranch took longer than the ride out. The wagon heavier with supplies, the horses tired from the heat. The sun had dropped below the horizon by the time Evan turned onto his property, the sky above painted in shades of purple and gold. The house came into view, lamplight glowing warm through the windows. And on the porch, silhouetted against that light, stood Clara with the rifle across her lap and 8 children gathered behind her. Evan's chest loosened. They were safe. They were waiting. They were still here. He pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down, his boots hitting the dust with a tired thud. Clara stood, setting the rifle aside, her expression caught between relief and residual fear. You came back, she said quietly. Told you I would. I know, but... She stopped, shook her head. I know. The children swarmed him then, questions tumbling over each other in a chaotic chorus. Evan fielded them as best he could, unloading the wagon with Peter's help while the others danced around his feet. That night, after the children had eaten and been coaxed into sleep, Evan sat at the kitchen table with Clara and explained what had happened in town. She listened without interruption, her face grave in the lamplight. So we have to wait, she said when he finished. Wait and hope a judge decides we're worth keeping. It's more than hope. We're building a case, showing we belong together. And if the judge disagrees? Evan met her eyes. Then we'll deal with that when it comes. But Clara, I need you to understand something. I didn't take you in because I thought it would be easy. I did it because it was right. And I don't quit on things that matter. Claire's hands were folded tightly on the table. After a long moment, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. My pa used to say that he didn't quit. She looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears. And then he did. He quit on living, quit on us, just gave up and left us with nothing. Evan felt the weight of those words, the grief and anger tangled up in them. He leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. I'm not your pa, Clara, and I'm not making promises I can't keep. What I'm saying is this. Every day I wake up, I'm choosing to be here, choosing to fight for you and those kids sleeping in there. That's not quitting. That's the opposite. A tear slid down Clara's cheek and she wiped it away quickly, almost angrily. I don't know how to trust that. You don't have to trust it yet. Just watch. See what I do, not what I say. And decide for yourself. She nodded slowly, her shoulders unbending just slightly. Okay? Okay. Evan stood, his body aching from the long day. Get some sleep. Tomorrow we start figuring out how to turn this house into something that looks like a real home. Clara rose, pausing at the doorway. Evan? Yeah? Thank you for going to town, for starting the paperwork, for... She stopped, searching for words. For not just saying you'd help, for actually doing it. Evan's throat tightened. You're welcome. She disappeared into the darkness of the next room, and Evan sank back into his chair, exhaustion pulling at every bone in his body. 9 children, legal battles, a man like Silas Brennan who wouldn't go quietly. The enormity of it all should have terrified him. But sitting there in the quiet, surrounded by the soft sounds of children breathing in sleep, Evan felt something unexpected. He felt purpose, and that, he thought, might just be enough to see them through. The following week passed in a blur of relentless work and slow, careful adjustment. Evan had never considered himself a patient man, but 9 children with 9 different histories of trauma and survival taught him patience, whether he felt ready for it or not. Thomas still woke screaming most nights, his small body rigid with terrors Evan couldn't fight for him. Lily spoke in whispers if she spoke at all, her faceless doll clutched tight against her chest. The twins communicated in a language that seemed to exist only between them, half words, half gestures, entirely impenetrable to outsiders. Annie cried whenever anyone raised their voice, even in laughter. Michael refused to be set down, his small arms locked around whatever neck was closest. Peter tried so hard to be helpful, he exhausted himself by midday. Ruth organized everything compulsively, toys, plates, shoes, as if order could protect them from chaos. And Clara stood guard over all of them, fierce and fragile in equal measure. Evan learned to move slowly, speak quietly, telegraph his intentions before acting. He learned which children needed space and which needed touch. He learned that routine mattered more than variety, that predictability was its own kind of safety. He also learned he had no idea what he was doing. On the 8th day, he found Ruth sitting on the porch steps at dawn, her small hands folded in her lap, tears streaming silently down her face. Evan lowered himself onto the step beside her, saying nothing, just sitting. After a long moment, Ruth spoke. I keep thinking I'm going to wake up and be back there, in the barn. And this will all be a dream I had while I was dying. Evan's chest constricted. This is real, Ruth. I promise you. But how do you know? How do you know it won't all just disappear? He didn't have a good answer for that. Didn't have words that could chase away fears rooted so deep they'd become part of who she was. So instead he stood and held out his hand. Come with me. Ruth hesitated, then took his hand. He led her to the barn, to the workbench where his tools hung in careful rows. He selected a hammer and a small bag of nails, then guided her to the fence line that bordered the eastern pasture. See that post there? He pointed to a fence post that had come loose, tilting at an angle. That needs fixing. Real, solid work that'll still be here tomorrow and next week and next year. He showed her how to hold the hammer, how to drive the nails straight, how to test the post's stability once it was secure. Ruth worked with intense concentration, her small face set with determination. When the post stood straight and firm, Evan stepped back. There. That's real. That's something you did with your own hands, and it's not going anywhere. Ruth touched the post, testing it, then looked up at him with something like wonder in her eyes. Every day we're here, Evan said quietly. We're building something real, something that lasts. And every day you wake up, and this place is still standing, you'll know it wasn't a dream. Ruth nodded slowly, her fingers still pressed against the solid wood. They walked back to the house together as the sun climbed higher, and Evan taught her the names of the birds calling from the cottonwoods, the difference between wolf tracks and coyote tracks in the dust, the way you could tell a storm was coming by the smell of the air. Real things, lasting things, evidence that the world could be more than loss. That evening, a rider appeared on the road. Not Silas Brennan, but a woman on a gray mare, riding side saddle with perfect posture despite the heat. She was perhaps 30, with dark hair pinned severely back and a dress that marked her as someone from town, someone educated. Evan stepped off the porch, his hand instinctively checking that his rifle was nearby. The children scattered behind him, Clara pulling the younger ones toward the house. The woman dismounted with practiced grace, looping her reins over the porch rail. Mr. Cole? That's right. My name is Adelaide Winters. I'm the school teacher in Clearwater. Marshal Cord suggested I ride out and introduce myself. Evan relaxed slightly, nodding. Miss Winters, appreciate you making the trip. Adelaide's eyes swept over the children peering from windows and around corners, her expression unreadable. The marshal tells me you've taken in 9 children in rather extraordinary circumstances. That's one way to put it. He also tells me you're seeking legal guardianship and that you'll be needing educational arrangements. Yes, ma'am. They've had gaps in their schooling. I see. Adelaide moved toward the porch, her movement slow and deliberate, clearly aware of the frightened eyes tracking her every step. She stopped a respectful distance away and addressed the children directly. Hello, my name is Miss Winters. I teach at the school in town. I'm very pleased to meet you. Silence. Then tentatively, Ruth stepped forward. Are you here to take us away? Adelaide's expression softened. No, sweetheart. I'm here to help you learn. Would you like that? Ruth glanced back at Clara, who gave a small nod. I guess so. Wonderful. Adelaide turned back to Evan. Might we speak privately? They walked toward the barn, out of earshot but still visible to the watchful children. Adelaide got straight to the point. Marshal Cord explained the situation. He believes you are sincere in your intent to care for these children, and I trust his judgment. However, I need to be honest with you, Mr. Cole. Integrating 9 traumatized children into a classroom of 20 is going to be challenging. I understand that. Do you? Her eyes were sharp, assessing. These children have experienced abandonment, neglect, possibly abuse. They're going to struggle with authority, with routine, with trusting adults. My other students' parents may have concerns. Evan's jaw tightened. Concerns about what? That orphans might be contagious? Concerns about disruption, about resources, about whether their own children's education will suffer. Adelaide held up a hand before he could respond. I'm not saying I agree with those concerns. I'm saying they exist, and we need to be prepared for them. So what are you suggesting? Adelaide was quiet for a moment, her gaze drifting back to the house where small faces watched from windows. When she spoke, her voice had lost its formality. I'm suggesting that before we bring them to town, we make sure they're ready, that they have proper clothes, basic supplies, some foundational skills that will help them keep up. And I'm suggesting that I come here twice a week to assess where they are and prepare them for integration. Evan stared at her. You'd do that? I became a teacher because I believe every child deserves education regardless of their circumstances. These 9 just happen to have had worse circumstances than most. She met his eyes directly. If you're serious about this, about giving them a real chance, then yes, I'll help. Something in Evan's chest loosened. What do you need from me? Space to work, basic supplies, slates, chalk, primers, and your support in maintaining consistent expectations. Education doesn't work if it only happens twice a week. You'll have all of that. Adelaide nodded crisply, then surprised him by smiling, a small, genuine expression that transformed her severe features. Then let's begin. Shall we meet the students properly? She spent the next hour with the children, speaking to each one individually, asking gentle questions, assessing not just their academic knowledge, but their emotional state, their fears, their readiness. She didn't push, didn't demand, just listened and observed with calm, professional attention. When she finally prepared to leave, Clara approached her hesitantly. Miss Winters, can I ask you something? Of course. Why are you helping us? You don't even know us. Adelaide considered the question seriously. When I was 7 years old, my father died. My mother couldn't manage alone, and we lost everything. For 2 years, we lived in a boarding house charity ward, dependent on strangers' goodwill. A teacher named Mrs. Brennan. She paused, noting Evan's sharp look at the name. No relation to your uncle, I assume. This Mrs. Brennan gave me books, taught me during her free hours, showed me that education could be a way out of poverty and helplessness. She looked at Clara steadily. I help you because someone helped me, and because you deserve it. Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back, nodding. Adelaide mounted her horse, gathering the reins. I'll return Thursday afternoon. In the meantime, Mr. Cole, I suggest you work on establishing daily structure. Children who've experienced chaos need routine like they need food and water. Yes, ma'am. She rode off into the gathering dusk, and Evan stood watching until she disappeared from view. Behind him, Peter spoke quietly. She seems nice. She does, Evan agreed. Do you think she really meant it? About coming back? Evan turned to look at the boy, 10 years old and already so familiar with broken promises that he couldn't believe in simple kindness. I think Miss Winters is exactly the kind of person who means what she says. How can you tell? Because she didn't promise things she couldn't control. She didn't say everything would be easy or perfect. She just said she'd show up and help. Evan put a hand on Peter's shoulder. That's the kind of promise worth believing in. That night, as Evan made his rounds checking doors and windows before bed, he found Clara still awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a candle burning low. Can't sleep? He asked. I keep thinking about what Miss Winters said, about us being ready. What if we're not? What if we go to that school and everyone hates us? Evan pulled out a chair and sat down across from her. Then we deal with it, together. You make it sound simple. It's not simple, but it's also not complicated. People are going to judge, they're going to talk. Some of them are going to be cruel because that's easier than being kind. He leaned forward. But here's what matters. You know who you are. Those kids in there know they're safe now. And slowly, one day at a time, you're all going to start believing you deserve to be. Clara's hands twisted in her lap. What if I don't deserve it? What if I'm too broken to be worth all this trouble? Clara. Evan waited until she looked up, until her eyes met his. You survived. You kept 8 other children alive when any sane person would have given up. You learned to shoot in 2 days because you were determined to protect your family. You're 12 years old and you've got more courage than most grown men I've known. His voice softened. You're not broken. You're bent. And bent things can straighten. It just takes time and the right support. A tear slid down her cheek, then another. Clara wiped them away roughly, her jaw set. I don't want to cry anymore. I'm tired of crying. Then don't. But if you need to, that's okay too. Crying doesn't make you weak. Feels like it does. Feels and is are 2 different things. Evan stood, moving to the window where moonlight spilled across the floorboards. You want to know what strength looks like to me? It's you, sitting at this table, admitting you're scared instead of pretending everything's fine. That takes more guts than not crying ever could. Clara was silent for a long moment, then quietly. Thank you. For what? For seeing me. Not just as another mouth to feed or another problem to solve. Actually seeing me. Evan turned back to her, and his voice was rough with emotion he didn't try to hide. You're not a problem, Clara. None of you are. You're people. And you're worth every bit of trouble, every sleepless night, every hard conversation. He paused. I need you to believe that. I'm trying. That's all I ask. Just keep trying. She nodded, standing and moving toward the room where the other children slept. At the doorway, she stopped and looked back. Evan? I think I'm starting to. Then she was gone, leaving Evan alone in the kitchen with a candle burning low and a weight in his chest that felt like hope beginning to take root. Outside, the night stretched vast and star-filled over the Wyoming prairie. Somewhere out there, Silas Brennan was planning his next move. Somewhere out there, judges and laws and bureaucracy waited to decide the fate of 9 children who'd already been failed by every system meant to protect them. But here, in this house, on this night, 9 children slept safe and fed and slowly starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, the world could be different than what they'd known. And Evan Cole stood guard, rifle within reach, heart full of a purpose he hadn't felt in over a decade. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. That was enough. For now, it was more than enough. Morning arrived with the kind of clarity that only comes after a storm has passed, though no rain had fallen. The air felt lighter somehow, or maybe it was just Evan's chest that didn't feel quite so heavy when he woke to the sound of children's voices drifting through the house. Not crying, not fearful, but talking in low murmurs as they helped each other dress and prepared for the day. He found them in the kitchen, Clara directing the organized chaos with the efficiency of someone twice her age. Ruth was setting plates. The twins were carrying water from the pump. Peter had already started a fire in the stove. Even little Michael was attempting to help, his small hands clutching a wooden spoon like it was a treasure. "Morning," Evan said from the doorway. 9 heads turned in unison, and for the first time since he'd found them, he saw something other than wariness in their eyes. Not quite trust yet, but something softer. Something that looked like the beginning of belonging. "We made breakfast," Clara announced, gesturing to the table where she'd laid out bread, butter, and the last of the preserves. "Well, we tried. The bread's a little hard." Evan picked up a slice, tore off a piece, chewed thoughtfully. "Tastes perfect to me." Clara's mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. "You're a terrible liar." "Maybe, but I'm an honest eater." He sat down at the head of the table, and the children arranged themselves around him with a naturalness that made his throat tight. This was what a family looked like, he thought. Not perfect, not polished, but present. They ate together as the sun climbed higher, and Evan explained the plan for the day. Miss Winters would arrive Thursday, which gave them 3 days to prepare. That meant cleaning, organizing, creating a space where learning could happen. But more than that, it meant establishing the routines Adelaide had mentioned, the structure that would help these children feel secure. "So we're really going to school?" Lily asked, her voice so quiet Evan almost missed it. It was the first full sentence he'd heard her speak. "Eventually, yes. But first we're going to practice here. Make sure you're ready." "What if we're not smart enough?" This from Thomas, his eyes downcast. Evan set his cup down carefully. "Smart enough for what?" "For school, for learning. Uncle Silas always said we were too stupid to waste teaching on." The words hit Evan like a physical blow. He took a slow breath, forcing his voice to stay calm. "Your uncle was wrong about a lot of things, Thomas. That's one of them. Every single one of you is smart enough to learn. Some things might come easier than others, and that's normal. But nobody here is too stupid for anything." "How do you know?" Ruth asked, her tone challenging. "Because stupid people don't survive what you survived. Stupid people don't keep 8 other kids alive in a barn with no food and no water. Stupid people don't learn to shoot in 2 days or organize a kitchen or remember everyone's fears and needs." He looked at each of them in turn. "You're not stupid, you're strong. And strength can learn anything if given the chance." The silence that followed was heavy with things unsaid, with years of being told they were worthless, with the slow, painful work of unlearning lies that had been carved into their bones. Finally, Peter spoke. "What do we do first?" "First," Evan said, standing, "we turn the front room into a schoolroom. Then we practice sitting still, listening, following instructions. Miss Winters is going to expect certain behaviors, and we need to show her you're ready." They worked through the morning with a focus that surprised Evan. The children moved furniture, swept floors, arranged chairs in neat rows. Clara found an old crate that could serve as a makeshift desk. The twins discovered a slate buried in the barn that just needed cleaning. Ruth organized the few books Evan owned by size and condition. By midday, the front room had been transformed. It wasn't fancy. The chairs didn't match, the floor still showed its age, the walls were bare, but it was clean and purposeful. A place where learning could take root. Evan stood in the doorway surveying their work. "This is good, real good." "Now what?" Clara asked. "Now we practice. Everyone take a seat." The children arranged themselves in the chairs, their postures uncertain, their eyes watchful. Evan stood at the front of the room, feeling ridiculous and important in equal measure. "First rule," he said, "when Miss Winters is talking, you listen. You don't interrupt. You don't talk to each other. You pay attention. Understood?" 9 heads nodded. "Second rule, if you need something, water, to use the outhouse, help with a lesson, you raise your hand and wait to be called on. You don't just get up and leave." More nods. "Third rule, you treat each other with respect. No name-calling, no fighting, no making anyone feel small. We're a family now, and families protect each other." This time the nods came slower, more thoughtful, as if the word family was something they were testing in their minds to see if it fit. They spent the next hour practicing, raising hands, waiting patiently, sitting still, even when it was hard. Evan asked simple questions and praised every attempt, even when answers were wrong. What mattered wasn't perfection, but effort. What mattered was showing them that trying was valued, that mistakes didn't lead to punishment. By the time he called a break, the children were restless but proud. They'd done something difficult and survived it. That was worth celebrating. That afternoon, Evan took them outside to work on the ranch, not because the work desperately needed doing, but because he wanted them to understand this place belonged to them now, that they had a stake in keeping it running. He assigned tasks based on ability and interest. Peter helped mend fence line, his long arms and growing strength proving useful. The twins took to feeding chickens with an enthusiasm that bordered on obsessive. Ruth organized the tool shed with the same precision she brought to everything. Clara worked alongside Evan mucking stalls, her silence comfortable rather than tense. Even the youngest ones had jobs, collecting eggs, pulling weeds from the garden, stacking kindling. The work was slow, inefficient, frequently interrupted by questions and mistakes. But Evan didn't care about efficiency. He cared about the way Thomas's face lit up when a chicken ate from his hand. He cared about how the twins synchronized their movements without speaking, a language only they understood. He cared about Ruth's satisfied sigh when every tool hung in its proper place. As the sun began its descent, Evan called them together near the barn. They gathered around him, sweaty and dirt-streaked and more alive than he'd ever seen them. "You did good work today," he said simply. "All of you. This ranch runs because of effort like that, because people show up and do what needs doing, even when it's hard." "Is that what being a family means?" Annie asked, her thumb sliding toward her mouth before Clara gently redirected it. Evan crouched down to her level. "That's part of it, yeah. Family means showing up, means doing your part, means knowing other people are counting on you and you're counting on them." "What's the other part?" He thought about that, choosing his words carefully. "The other part is love, but not the easy kind you feel when everything's good. The hard kind. The kind that stays even when people mess up, or have bad days, or say things they don't mean. The kind that doesn't quit." Annie considered this with the seriousness only a 4-year-old could muster. "Do you love us?" The question caught Evan off guard. He looked at these 9 children, strangers 2 weeks ago, now somehow essential, and realized the answer was more complicated than yes or no. "I'm learning to," he said honestly. "Love takes time. But I care about you. I want you safe and happy and fed and taught. And every day I'm here choosing to do that, I'm building toward love. Does that make sense?" Annie nodded slowly. "I think so." "Good." He straightened, his knees protesting. "Now let's get cleaned up for supper." They trooped inside, tracking dust and joy in equal measure. Evan watched them go, watched Clara automatically check that everyone washed hands, watched Peter help Michael reach the basin, watched Ruth count heads to make sure no one was left behind. They were becoming something. He didn't have a name for it yet, but it was real and growing and worth protecting. That night, after the children slept, Evan sat on the porch with his rifle and his thoughts. The stars overhead were sharp and bright, the kind of night that made the world feel both infinite and intimate. He was thinking about love and family and promises when he heard the sound of hooves approaching in the darkness. His hand moved to the rifle, his body tensing, but the rider who emerged from the shadows wasn't Silas Brennan. It was Marshal Frank Cord, his face grim even in the moonlight. "Frank," Evan said, standing, "what brings you out here this late?" Frank dismounted, tying his horse to the rail. "Needed to talk to you. Didn't want to wait till morning." Evan's gut tightened. "What happened?" "Silas Brennan filed a counterpetition, claims you kidnapped his wards, that he never abandoned them, that he's a fit guardian who wants them returned immediately." The words landed like stones. Evan forced himself to breathe, to think. "That's a lie." "I know it is. You know it is. But he's got a lawyer now, some snake from Cheyenne who specializes in these cases. And he's making noise about parental rights and family preservation and how the law favors blood relatives. Those kids aren't his blood. Only Clara is his niece. The rest doesn't matter to the law. He was acting as legal guardian when you took them. That gives him standing." Frank's expression was pained. "Judge Cartwright set a hearing for 2 weeks from today. You're going to have to present your case, and Brennan's going to present his, and the judge is going to decide." Evan's hands clenched. "What do I need to do?" "Everything we already talked about. character witnesses, proof you can provide, evidence of Brennan's unfitness. But Evan, Frank hesitated. You need to prepare those kids. They're going to have to testify. They're going to have to stand in front of a judge and a courtroom full of strangers and tell the truth about what happened to them. The thought of forcing these children, already traumatized, already terrified, to relive their worst moments in public made Evan feel sick. Isn't there another way? Not if you want to win. Brennan's lawyer is already claiming the kids are being coached, that you've turned them against their loving uncle. The only way to counter that is to let them speak for themselves. They're children, Frank. Some of them barely talk. Lily didn't say a full sentence until this morning. Thomas still has nightmares every night. You're asking them to— I'm not asking anything, Frank cut him off gently. The law is— I know it's not fair. I know it's going to be hard. But if you want to keep them, this is what has to happen. Evan turned away, staring out at the darkness beyond the porch. 2 weeks. 14 days to prepare 9 traumatized children to face their abuser in court. 14 days to build a case strong enough to overcome blood relation and legal precedent. 14 days to prove that he, a man who'd lived alone for a decade, who'd failed his own family once before, deserved to be trusted with 9 young lives. Will you help me? He asked quietly. Every way I can. Evan nodded once, decision made. Then let's figure out how to do this right. They talked for over an hour, Frank explaining courtroom procedure, what questions the judge might ask, what evidence would be most compelling. When Frank finally rode off into the night, Evan stayed on the porch until dawn began to gray the eastern sky. He didn't know how to prepare children for this, didn't know how to ask them to be brave when they'd already been brave beyond measure. But he knew he had to try. When Clara emerged for breakfast, she found Evan still sitting in the same spot, his rifle across his lap, his eyes red-rimmed from sleeplessness. You didn't come to bed, she said. Couldn't sleep. She sat down beside him, drawing her knees to her chest. Something happened. I can tell. Evan debated lying, protecting her for just a little longer, but she deserved the truth. They all did. Your uncle filed papers. He wants you back. All of you. Clara's body went rigid. No. There's going to be a hearing. In 2 weeks. A judge will decide. We're not going back. Her voice was steel wrapped in terror. We can't. He'll kill us. I know. And we're going to fight this. But Clara— He turned to face her fully. You're going to have to testify. You're going to have to tell the judge what happened, what your uncle did. Her breathing quickened. In front of him? In front of everyone? Yes. I can't. I can't do that. You can. You're the strongest person I know. I'm 12. The words broke on a sob. I'm just 12, and I'm so tired of being strong. Evan pulled her into his arms, and she collapsed against him, her body shaking with the force of tears she'd been holding back for weeks, maybe years. He held her while she cried, while she soaked his shirt with grief and fear and exhaustion, while the sun came up over a world that demanded more from children than children should ever have to give. When her sobs finally quieted, Evan spoke into her hair. You're right. You're 12. You shouldn't have to do this. But the world isn't fair, and sometimes we have to do hard things anyway. Not because we want to, but because nobody else can. Clara pulled back, wiping her face on her sleeve. What if I mess up? What if I freeze or say the wrong thing, or he scares me so bad I can't talk? Then we'll deal with it. But Clara, listen to me. You've already survived the worst thing he could do to you. You survived that barn. You survived watching the people you love nearly die. You survived 3 days thinking nobody was coming. He took her face in his hands, gentle but firm. Talking about it in front of a judge, that's nothing compared to what you've already done. It doesn't feel like nothing. I know. But here's what I need you to understand. You're not doing this alone. I'll be right there. Miss Winters will be there. Marshall Cord will be there. And when you stand up to tell your truth, you'll have 8 other kids who are alive because you kept them that way. That's power, Clara. That's strength he can never take from you. She was quiet for a long time, her eyes searching his face. Finally, she nodded. Okay, I'll do it. But you have to help me. You have to teach me what to say. Not what to say, just how to say it. The truth is enough. We just need to make sure it's heard. They sat together as the ranch woke around them, as the other children stumbled out rubbing sleep from their eyes, as the day began its relentless march toward a future neither of them could predict. That morning, Evan gathered all 9 children in the schoolroom. He explained the situation in terms they could understand, watching their faces cycle through fear and anger and resignation. When he finished, the silence was absolute. Then Thomas spoke, his voice small but determined. I'll tell the judge what Uncle Silas did." "Me too," Ruth added. "And me," Peter said. One by one, they volunteered. Even Lily, who'd barely spoken, nodded her head with fierce determination. Only Annie looked uncertain, her thumb creeping toward her mouth. "What if I'm scared?" Evan knelt beside her. "Then you be scared. That's okay. Brave doesn't mean not afraid. Brave means doing the thing anyway. Will you be there? Every second. Promise?" "Promise." She nodded, satisfied. "Then I'll try." Evan stood, looking at these 9 children who'd already endured more than most adults, who were now preparing to endure even more. Pride swelled in his chest, fierce and aching. "We're going to practice," he said. "Every day until the hearing. We're going to practice telling the truth calmly and clearly. We're going to practice sitting in a strange room with strangers watching. We're going to practice being brave, even when it's terrifying. And when that day comes, you're going to walk into that courtroom with your heads high because you've got nothing to be ashamed of. Understood?" "Yes, sir," they chorused. "Good. Then let's get to work." The next 2 weeks were a blur of preparation. Adelaide Winters arrived as promised on Thursday, and when she learned about the hearing, immediately offered to help. She coached the children on courtroom etiquette, on speaking clearly, on staying calm under pressure. She was patient and firm in equal measure, never letting them wallow in fear, but never dismissing it either. Marshal Cord visited twice more, bringing updates on Brennan's case and offering advice on what the judge would want to hear. Evan wrote testimony, revised it, wrote it again. He reached out to Mrs. Halstead at the general store, who agreed to testify about the children's improved condition. He documented everything: meals provided, clothes purchased, routines established, evidence of care and stability. Through it all, the children held together with a unity that took Evan's breath away. They supported each other through nightmares and panic attacks. They practiced their testimony until the words came smooth. They grew stronger, not despite their fear, but because they faced it together. The night before the hearing, Evan found himself unable to sleep again. He stood in the doorway of the room where all 9 children slept, watching the rise and fall of their breathing, the way they'd instinctively arranged themselves into a protective circle even in sleep. Clara's voice came from the darkness. "You should rest. Tomorrow's going to be long." Evan smiled slightly. "Could say the same to you." She sat up, careful not to disturb the others. "I keep thinking about what you said, about already surviving the worst thing." "Having second thoughts?" "No. I was thinking you're right. The barn was worse. The days before the barn were worse. Whatever happens tomorrow, at least we'll have had these 2 weeks. At least we'll know what it feels like to be wanted." Evan's throat tightened. "You're going to have more than 2 weeks, Clara. You're going to have years. A lifetime." "You can't promise that. Watch me." He moved into the room, settling on the floor near where she sat. "I've already lost one family. I won't lose another. Whatever that judge says, whatever the law decides, you're mine now. All of you. And I protect what's mine." Clara's eyes glistened in the moonlight. "Even if it means breaking the law?" Evan held her gaze, his voice steady and certain. "Even then." She nodded slowly, understanding passing between them, an unspoken pact that whatever tomorrow brought, they'd face it together. Then she lay back down, curling around little Michael, and closed her eyes. Evan stayed where he was until he was sure she slept. Then he returned to the porch, to his rifle and his vigil, and waited for dawn. The sun rose blood-red over Wyoming, painting the sky in shades of warning. Evan, dressed in his only good suit, helped the children into the clothes they'd carefully prepared. Adelaide arrived early with ribbons for the girls' hair and encouraging words for everyone. Marshal Cord came with a wagon large enough to carry them all to town. They loaded up in silence, the weight of what lay ahead pressing down on shoulders too small to carry it. But they didn't complain, didn't cry, just held hands and held tight and prepared to do what had to be done. As the wagon rolled toward Clearwater, toward the courthouse and the judge and Silas Brennan waiting with his lawyer and his lies, Evan looked at the 9 faces surrounding him and felt something shift in his chest. These weren't just children he was protecting anymore. They were his children, his family, his reason for waking up and his reason for fighting and his reason for believing that love, real, hard, unquitting love, was worth every risk. The courthouse came into view, imposing and official against the morning sky. The wagon slowed. The moment of reckoning approached. Evan took a deep breath and prepared to fight the most important battle of his life. Not for himself, for them, for family, for the future they deserved and the past that had tried to destroy them. The wagon stopped. Marshal Cord set the brake. Adelaide smoothed the children's clothes one last time, and together, all 11 of them walked toward the courthouse doors, ready to face whatever came next with heads high and hearts bound together by something stronger than blood. Something that looked like hope, beginning to believe in itself. The courthouse doors swung open with a weight that seemed to echo through Evan's bones. Inside, the air was cooler but no less oppressive, thick with the smell of old wood and older judgments. The hallway stretched ahead of them, polished floors reflecting the nervous faces of 9 children who'd dressed in their best clothes and tried to scrub away the evidence of lives spent surviving. A clerk directed them to a waiting room, small, airless, with benches that lined the walls like pews. Evan settled the children there, Adelaide sitting among them like a protective barrier. Claire's hand found his sleeve and gripped tight. "He's here," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the hallway beyond. "I can feel it." Evan followed her gaze and saw Silas Brennan standing near the courtroom entrance, his posture relaxed, confident. Next to him stood a man in an expensive suit, leather satchel in hand, the kind of lawyer who knew exactly how to twist truth into something unrecognizable. Silas caught Evan's eye and smiled, a cold, calculated expression that promised violence wrapped in legality. Evan squeezed Clara's hand once, then stood and walked directly toward them. "Cole," Silas said, his voice carrying false warmth, "come to surrender my property?" "They're not property, they're children." The lawyer stepped forward, extending his hand with professional courtesy Evan didn't return. "Theodore Garrett, representing Mr. Brennan. I understand you've grown attached to these children, Mr. Cole, but attachment doesn't supersede legal guardianship. Neither does abandonment and attempted murder." Garrett's smile didn't waver. "Strong accusations. I hope you have equally strong evidence, because Mr. Brennan has quite a different story to tell." "I'm sure he does. Liars usually do." Silas's face flushed red, but Garrett put a restraining hand on his arm. "We'll let the judge sort out truth from fiction. That's what courts are for." Marshal Cord appeared at Evan's elbow, his presence a silent warning to keep things civil. Evan nodded once and returned to the waiting room, his jaw so tight it ached. "What did he say?" Clara asked. "Nothing worth repeating." Evan crouched down so he could see all 9 faces. "Listen to me. In a few minutes, we're going to walk into that courtroom. You're going to see your uncle. You're going to hear him lie about what happened. And it's going to make you angry and scared and maybe want to yell or cry or run." 9 pairs of eyes watched him with absolute focus. "But here's what you're going to do instead," Evan continued. "You're going to sit still and quiet. You're going to remember that lies have power only if people believe them. And when it's your turn to speak, you're going to tell the truth so clearly, so calmly, that nobody in that room will have any doubt about who you are and what you survived." "What if I forget?" Thomas asked, his voice thin with anxiety. "Then you take a breath and remember one thing. You're still alive. That's all the proof you need that you're stronger than whatever he tried to do to you." The courtroom door opened and the clerk called them in. The room was smaller than Evan had imagined, with wooden benches for observers and a raised platform where Judge Cartwright sat, a stern-looking man in his 60s with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. A court reporter sat to one side, fingers poised over her machine. Silas and his lawyer took their position at one table. Evan, with Adelaide's help, arranged the children on benches directly behind the table where he'd sit. Marshal Cord stood near the back, a silent presence that somehow made the room feel safer. Judge Cartwright surveyed the room, his gaze lingering on the children. This is a hearing to determine guardianship of 9 minors currently in the care of Mr. Evan Cole, contested by Mr. Silas Brennan, who claims legal standing as uncle to one and previous guardian to all. We'll hear from both parties, then I'll make my determination. He looked directly at Evan. Mr. Cole, you're representing yourself? Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Brennan has legal counsel. You understand you're at a disadvantage. I understand the truth doesn't need a lawyer, Your Honor. A flicker of something, amusement, maybe approval, crossed the judge's face. We'll see. Mr. Garrett, you may present your case. Theodore Garrett rose with practiced ease, his voice smooth as oil on water. He painted a picture of Silas Brennan as a devoted uncle who'd taken in his orphan niece and 8 other destitute children out of pure Christian charity. A man who'd struggled financially but never wavered in his commitment. A man who'd made the difficult decision to temporarily relocate the children to a safer location while he secured better employment, only to return and find them stolen by a stranger with questionable motives. Mr. Brennan deeply regrets the misunderstanding that led to the children's current placement, Garrett said, his tone sympathetic. But he's here today to rectify that situation and reclaim his responsibility as their rightful guardian. Evan's hands clenched under the table. Every word was a careful distortion, truth bent just enough to seem plausible while erasing the reality of what these children had endured. Your Honor, Garrett continued, we ask that you order the immediate return of these children to Mr. Brennan's care, and furthermore, that you consider charges against Mr. Cole for unlawful interference with familial rights. The judge made a note, his expression unreadable. Mr. Cole, your response? Evan stood, his suit feeling too tight, his mouth dry. He'd practiced this moment 100 times, but standing here with 9 lives hanging in the balance made every rehearsed word evaporate. Your Honor, Mr. Garrett just told you a story. Now I'm going to tell you what actually happened. He pulled out a piece of paper, his hand steady despite the fear coursing through him. On New Year's Eve, I found 9 children locked in an abandoned barn on my property. They'd been without food or water for 3 days in 100-degree heat. 3 days, Your Honor. The youngest was 3 years old. They were dehydrated, sunburned, malnourished, and left to die. That's a lie, Silas interrupted, half rising from his seat. Judge Cartwright's gavel came down hard. Mr. Brennan, you'll have your chance to speak. Sit down. Silas sat, but his eyes burned with rage. Evan continued, his voice growing stronger. I brought them to my ranch, fed them, gave them water, shelter, medical care, and when Mr. Brennan showed up days later, he didn't ask if they were okay, didn't apologize for leaving them. He demanded them back like they were livestock he'd misplaced. Mr. Cole's interpretation, Garrett began, but the judge held up a hand. I'll hear evidence, not interpretation. Mr. Cole, do you have witnesses? Yes, Your Honor. Marshal Cord can testify to the children's condition when he first saw them. Mrs. Halstead from the general store can testify to the clothing and supplies I've purchased for their care. Miss Adelaide Winters, the school teacher, can testify to their educational progress and current well-being. He paused. And the children themselves can testify to what Mr. Brennan did to them. Judge Cartwright leaned forward. You want to put children on the stand? I want them to have a voice, Your Honor. They're the only ones who know the whole truth. The judge was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving from Evan to the children sitting silent and terrified behind him. How old is the youngest? 3, Your Honor. 3-year-olds can't testify reliably. Then I'll start with the oldest. Clara Brennan is 12. She's articulate, intelligent, and she remembers everything. Judge Cartwright studied Clara, who sat rigid with her hands folded in her lap, her face pale, but composed. Very well. We'll hear from Marshal Cord first, then the other adults. If I find their testimony warrants it, I'll allow the children to speak. But Mr. Cole, I warn you, if I suspect coaching or manipulation, I'll end this hearing immediately and rule in favor of blood relation. Understood? Yes, Your Honor. Marshal Cord took the stand first, swearing his oath with the gravity of a man who understood the weight of his words. He described arriving at Evans Ranch 4 days after the children had been found, seeing their condition, observing their fear of Silas Brennan. These weren't children who'd been temporarily misplaced, Frank said, his voice steady and certain. These were children who'd been deliberately abandoned. I've seen neglect before, Your Honor. This was worse. This was malice. Garrett cross-examined, trying to poke holes, suggesting the children could have wandered to the barn on their own, that their condition could have been exaggerated. But Frank didn't budge, didn't waver, just repeated what he'd seen with his own eyes. Mrs. Halstead followed, testifying about the supplies Evan had purchased, clothes in every size, enough food to feed a crowd, medicines, and bandages. A man doesn't spend that kind of money on children he's planning to abandon, she said firmly. Mr. Cole has been providing for those children like they're his own. Adelaide Winters was last among the adults, and her testimony carried a different kind of weight. She described her initial assessment of the children, their educational deficits, their trauma responses, their deep mistrust of adults. Then she described their progress over the past 2 weeks. I've been teaching for 12 years, Your Honor, Adelaide said. I've worked with orphans, with children from difficult circumstances, but I've never seen transformation like this. These children are healing because someone finally gave them safety and consistency. Mr. Cole isn't perfect. He has no formal training in childcare or education, but he shows up every day, and that matters more than any credential. Judge Cartwright made notes, his expression thoughtful. Mr. Garrett, do you wish to call witnesses? Just one, Your Honor, Mr. Silas Brennan. Silas took the stand with confidence, his hand on the Bible steady and sure. He told his version smoothly, how he'd struggled financially after taking in his niece and the other orphans, how he'd worked himself to exhaustion trying to provide, how he'd made arrangements with a family in the next county to care for the children temporarily while he found better employment. I left them in that barn for no more than a few hours, Your Honor, Silas said, his voice earnest. I was supposed to meet the family there to make the handoff, but when I got delayed and returned, the children were gone, stolen by Mr. Cole, who's filled their heads with lies about me. It was a masterful performance. If Evan hadn't known the truth, hadn't seen the children's condition, he might have believed it himself. Mr. Cole claims you showed up at his ranch making threats, the judge said. Is that accurate? I was upset, Your Honor, desperate to find my children. Maybe I spoke harshly, but I was scared for their safety. I didn't know this stranger or what his intentions were. Evan's jaw clenched so hard he thought his teeth might crack. Judge Cartwright studied Silas for a long moment. Mr. Brennan, why didn't you report the children missing to the marshal? Silas blinked, the first crack in his composure. I did, Your Honor. I went to the marshal's office in the next county over. And yet Marshal Cord, who serves this county, heard nothing about missing children until Mr. Cole came to him. Why is that? Must have been a communication error, Your Honor. Must have been. The judge made another note. Mr. Garrett, anything else? No, Your Honor. The evidence speaks for itself. Mr. Brennan is the legal guardian. He has family connection to at least one child, and his explanation for the circumstances is reasonable. We ask that you return the children to his care immediately. Judge Cartwright sat back in his chair, his fingers steepled. Mr. Cole, you wanted the children to testify. I'm inclined to allow it, but I'm going to start with the oldest and proceed from there. If at any point I feel the testimony is coached or the children are being traumatized by this process, I'll stop. Clear? Yes, Your Honor. Call your first witness. Evan turned to look at Clara, who sat frozen, her eyes wide and terrified. He mouthed 2 words. You're ready. Clara stood on shaking legs and walked to the witness stand. The clerk administered the oath, and Clara's voice was barely audible as she promised to tell the truth. Judge Cartwright asked her to speak up, and she tried again, louder this time. Clara, Evan said gently, standing near but not too close, can you tell the judge your full name? Clara Margaret Brennan. How old are you? 12. Is Silas Brennan your uncle? Yes. When did you come to live with him? Clara's hands twisted in her lap. 2 years ago, after my pa died. Did your uncle treat you well? She was silent for a long moment, then quietly. No. Can you explain what you mean? Her voice cracked. She looked at Silas, who was staring at her with cold fury, and her courage nearly failed. But then she looked at Evan, at Adelaide, at the 8 children sitting behind her who needed her to be brave, and something in her spine straightened. "He collected money from the county for taking care of us," Clara said, her voice growing steadier. "But he kept it all. He fed us scraps, made us work from before sunrise to after dark, called us worthless, told us we were burdens nobody wanted." "Lies," Silas hissed, but Garrett put a warning hand on his arm. "What happened on New Year's Eve?" Evan asked. Claire's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. "He took us to the barn. All 9 of us. Said someone was coming to take us to a better place. We believed him because—" her voice broke. "Because we wanted to believe someone would want us." "How long did you wait?" 3 days. We had no food, no water. The littlest ones cried until they couldn't cry anymore. Thomas got so sick I thought—" She stopped, pressing a hand to her mouth. "Take your time," Judge Cartwright said, his voice gentler than before. Clara nodded, swallowed, continued. "I kept telling them someone would come, that we just had to hold on, and then Mr. Cole found us." "What was your condition when he found you?" "We were dying, all of us. Another day and I don't think—" She couldn't finish. Evan gave her a moment, then asked the question that mattered most. "Clara, do you want to go back to your uncle?" "No." The word came out fierce and absolute. "I'd rather die than go back." Judge Cartwright leaned forward. "That's a strong statement, young lady." Clara turned to face him directly. "You weren't in that barn, Your Honor. You didn't feel what it's like to know you've been thrown away, that nobody's coming because nobody cares if you live or die." Her voice rose, years of pain pouring out. "Mr. Cole came. He didn't have to. He could have walked away. But he came back and he carried us out and he gave us food and water and a place to sleep. And for the first time in 2 years, I felt like maybe I was worth something after all." The courtroom was absolutely silent. Even the court reporter had stopped typing. "Do you love Mr. Cole?" the judge asked. Clara considered the question seriously. "I'm learning to, same as he's learning to love us. But love isn't the point, Your Honor. Safety is. And I feel safe with Mr. Cole. I've never felt safe with my uncle. Not once." "Thank you, Clara. You may step down." Clara returned to her seat and Ruth immediately took her hand. Evan watched the judge's face, trying to read his thoughts, but the man's expression remained carefully neutral. "Mr. Garrett, do you wish to cross-examine?" Garrett stood, and Evan's stomach dropped. The lawyer approached Clara with a sympathetic smile. "Clara, I know this has been difficult, but I have to ask, did Mr. Cole tell you what to say today?" "No." "Did he suggest that if you said certain things, you'd get to stay with him?" "No, he told me to tell the truth." "The truth as you remember it, or the truth as he explained it to you?" Clara's eyes narrowed. "I know what happened to me. I don't need anyone to explain it." "Of course. But sometimes, when we're grateful to someone, we might exaggerate or misremember things in ways that favor them. Is it possible you're doing that now?" "No." Clara's voice was hard as stone. "I remember every minute in that barn. Every time we cried for help. Every time we thought we were going to die. That's not something you exaggerate." Garrett tried a few more approaches, but Clara didn't budge, didn't contradict herself, didn't waver. Finally, he sat down, and the judge called Thomas to the stand. Thomas was smaller, more fragile, his voice so quiet the judge had to ask him to repeat answers multiple times. But his testimony matched Clara's. The barn, the heat, the abandonment, the certainty that they'd been left to die. "My little sister died of fever last year," Thomas said, his eyes downcast. "Uncle Silas said it was her own fault for being weak. Said we'd all probably die the same way and good riddance." One by one, the children testified. Ruth described the work they'd been forced to do, the verbal abuse, the constant fear. Peter showed the scars on his back from beatings. The twins spoke in their fragmented way about being locked in closets when they misbehaved. Judge Cartwright stopped them before the youngest children had to testify. "I've heard enough," he said, his voice heavy. "This court is in recess for 1 hour while I review the evidence and reach a decision." The courtroom emptied slowly. Evan gathered the children close, all 9 of them pressing against him like they could make themselves small enough to hide from whatever came next. "You did good," he told them quietly. "All of you. I'm proud." "What happens now?" Clara asked. "We wait." The hours stretched like years. They sat in the waiting room, speaking in whispers, holding hands, existing in the space between hope and devastation. Adelaide brought water. No one drank. Marshall Cord paced the hallway. Evan prayed to a God he wasn't sure he believed in anymore, bargaining with the universe for just this one thing, this one chance to make something right. When the clerk finally called them back, Evan's heart was pounding so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. Judge Cartwright sat at his bench, papers spread before him, his face grave. "I've reviewed the testimony, considered the evidence, and reached a decision. But before I announce it, I want to address something." He looked at Silas Brennan with an expression of barely controlled disgust. "Mr. Brennan, I've been a judge for 23 years. I've seen every kind of lie, every type of manipulation, and I know calculated cruelty when I see it. Your testimony today was a fabrication. The evidence proves it. The children's testimony confirms it. You didn't misplace these children. You tried to kill them." Silas started to stand, but Garrett pulled him down. "However," the judge continued, "this is a guardianship hearing, not a criminal trial. My job here is to determine what's in the best interest of these children, not to prosecute crimes, though I'm forwarding this case to the district attorney with a strong recommendation for charges." He turned to Evan. "Mr. Cole, you're an unmarried man with no experience raising children. You live alone on a ranch with limited resources. By traditional standards, you're not an ideal guardian." Evan's chest tightened, hope beginning to crack. "But traditional standards," the judge said, his voice softening, "failed these children. Their blood relative failed them. The system that was supposed to protect them failed them. You, Mr. Cole, did not fail them. You saved them. And in the 2 weeks they've been in your care, they've shown more progress, more healing, more hope than they saw in 2 years with their legal guardian." He picked up his gavel. "Therefore, I'm terminating Silas Brennan's guardianship effective immediately. I'm granting temporary custody of all 9 children to Evan Cole, with a review hearing in 6 months to determine permanent guardianship. Mr. Brennan is ordered to have no contact with any of these children. Marshall Cord, please escort Mr. Brennan from the courthouse." The gavel came down with a sound like thunder. For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. Then Clara made a sound, half sob, half laugh, and suddenly all 9 children were pressing around Evan, crying and laughing and holding on like they'd never let go. Silas was shouting something, his lawyer trying to calm him, but Marshall Cord was already guiding him firmly toward the door. Adelaide was crying openly. The court reporter was smiling despite herself, and Evan stood in the center of it all, 9 children in his arms, his face buried in Clara's hair, his shoulders shaking with relief and joy, and the terrible, wonderful weight of what he'd just been given. Responsibility, trust, family. "We get to stay?" Thomas asked, his voice muffled against Evan's chest. "You get to stay," Evan confirmed, his voice rough. "All of you. You're mine now. Legally, officially, mine." "Forever?" Annie whispered. Evan pulled back enough to see their faces. 9 children who'd learned the world was cruel, who'd been taught they were worthless, who'd survived anyway, and somehow found their way to his doorstep. "Forever," he promised. "That's not changing. Not ever." They left the courthouse as the sun reached its apex, heat beating down but somehow easier to bear. The wagon ride home was different than the ride there, lighter, louder, filled with voices that dared to hope out loud. When the ranch came into view, Evan saw it differently than he had that morning. Not just property anymore, not just land and buildings and livestock. Home. The children piled out of the wagon and scattered, running through the yard, shouting with relief and joy, celebrating in the way only children who'd been freed from fear could celebrate. Evan stood watching them, his heart full to bursting, and felt Adelaide come to stand beside him. "You did it," she said quietly. "We did it. Couldn't have without you." "What now?" Evan smiled, watching Ruth organize the others into some kind of game, watching the twins chase each other in circles, watching Clara laugh, actually laugh, for the first time since he'd known her. Now, he said, we figure out how to be a family. That's harder than winning in court. I know. He looked at her, this teacher who'd believed in him when she had no reason to. But I've got help, and I've got time, and I've got 9 reasons to get it right. Adelaide nodded, satisfied. Then I suspect you will. That night, after supper and chores and the chaos of getting 9 children ready for bed, Evan sat on the porch watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. The rifle still leaned against the wall, but the tension in his shoulders had finally eased. Clara found him there, wrapped in a quilt despite the warm evening. Can't sleep? Evan asked. Didn't want to yet. Feels like if I sleep, I might wake up and find out it was all a dream. It's real, Clara. The judge's order, the custody, all of it. She sat down beside him, pulling the quilt tighter. What made you do it? Take us in that first night? Evan was quiet for a long time, watching the last light fade from the western sky. When he spoke, his voice was raw with memory. I had a family once, a wife, a daughter. Fever took them both in the same week. He paused, swallowing hard. After they died, I told myself I'd never love like that again. Never risk that kind of pain, so I lived alone, kept the world at arm's length, thought I was protecting myself. What changed? You did. All of you. He looked at her. Standing in that barn, seeing 9 kids the world had thrown away, I realized something. Living without pain meant living without purpose. Living without risk meant living without love. And that's not living at all, that's just waiting to die. Clara's eyes glistened. So you saved us? No. Evan shook his head. You saved me. You gave me a reason to wake up fighting, a reason to believe I could be more than the man I'd become. They sat in comfortable silence as full darkness fell and the ranch settled into sleep around them. Evan, Clara said finally, thank you for everything, for fighting, for not giving up, for, her voice broke, for making us believe we were worth it. Evan put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, solid and real in his. You've always been worth it, Clara. Took me finding you to remember that I was too. Stars wheeled overhead. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called. Inside the house, 8 children slept safe and sound. And on the porch of a ranch in Wyoming, a man and a girl sat together in the quiet, learning what family felt like when it was built on choice rather than blood, on promise rather than obligation, on love that refused to quit even when quitting would have been easier. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. 6 months would bring another hearing. The years ahead would bring struggles and setbacks and moments of doubt. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, they were together. They were safe. They were home. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The days after the hearing carried a lightness that felt almost dangerous, like maybe if they relaxed too much, if they believed too hard, the universe would remember to snatch it all away. But Evan watched the children move through their routines with a freedom they hadn't possessed before. Shoulders less hunched, voices less guarded, smiles that came easier and stayed longer. The ranch transformed in ways both subtle and profound. Chalk drawings appeared on the porch boards. A rope swing materialized on the old cottonwood near the creek, the twins taking turns pushing each other higher and higher until Evan had to call out warnings about broken bones. Ruth organized a small garden plot, planting seeds she'd saved from dinner vegetables with the determination of someone building permanence. Peter took to following Evan everywhere, absorbing ranch work like he was memorizing a language he'd always wanted to speak. And Clara began to let go. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in small increments that added up to something profound. Evan would catch her playing with the younger children instead of just supervising them, would hear her humming while she worked, would see her face turn toward the sun with eyes closed, just breathing, just existing without the weight of constant vigilance. But transformation wasn't smooth. Healing never was. 3 weeks after the hearing, Evan woke to screaming, Thomas thrashing in his bed, eyes open but unseen, trapped in some nightmare that wouldn't release him. Evan rushed in to find Clara already there, trying to calm him, but Thomas was beyond reach, locked in terror that had nothing to do with the present. Thomas, you're safe, Clara kept saying, her own voice tight with remembered fear. You're home, you're safe. But the boy kept screaming, kept fighting invisible demons, until Evan did the only thing he could think of. He gathered Thomas into his arms and carried him outside into the cool night air. The shock of temperature change broke through. Thomas gasped, his body going rigid, then collapsing into sobs that shook his small frame like an earthquake. I was back there, he choked out between sobs. In the barn, and nobody came. Nobody came, and we all died, and— But you didn't die, Evan said firmly, sitting down on the porch steps with Thomas still in his arms. You're here. You're breathing. You survived. What if it happens again? What happens again? What if you leave us? What if you get sick or die or just decide we're too much trouble? Evan's chest tightened. This was the fear beneath all the others, the one that nightmares fed on. Thomas, look at me. The boy raised his tear-streaked face. I can't promise I'll never die, Evan said quietly. Nobody can promise that, but I can promise I will never ever leave you on purpose. I will never decide you're too much trouble. And if something did happen to me, there are people now, Miss Winters, Marshall Cord, Mrs. Halstead, who know you and care about you and would make sure you stayed safe. But I want you. The words were so simple, so devastating in their honesty. Evan felt something crack open in his chest. Not breaking, but opening, making room for a love so fierce it terrified him. And you have me, he said, his voice rough. For as long as I'm breathing, you have me. All of you. That's not changing. Thomas buried his face in Evan's shoulder and cried until he had nothing left. By the time his breathing evened out into sleep, dawn was breaking over the eastern hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Clara appeared in the doorway, her own face showing the strain of sleepless worry. Is he okay? He will be, eventually. We all will be. Do you really believe that? Evan looked at her, this girl who'd carried so much for so long, and nodded. I have to, and so do you. Because if we don't believe we can heal, we never will. She sat down beside him, and they watched the sun rise together while Thomas slept on, exhausted but safe, held by someone who wouldn't let go. That morning, Evan made a decision. He called all 9 children together in the schoolroom and laid out a piece of paper and a pencil. We're going to do something today, he said. Something important. Each of you is going to write down or tell me your biggest fear, the thing that keeps you up at night, the worry that won't let go. The children exchanged uncertain glances. Why? Ruth asked suspiciously. Because fear has power when it's hidden. When we name it, when we drag it into the light, it gets smaller, doesn't disappear, but gets manageable. He picked up the pencil. I'll go first. My biggest fear is that I'll fail you. That I'll make a mistake so big it'll hurt you worse than what you've already been through. He wrote it down, his handwriting stark against the white paper. Then he passed the pencil to Clara. She stared at it for a long moment before writing in careful letters. I'm afraid nobody will ever really want me. That I'm only here because Evan felt sorry for us. Ruth took the pencil next. I'm afraid everything will fall apart if I stop organizing it. One by one, they shared. Peter feared he wasn't strong enough to protect his new family. The twins feared being separated. Lily feared her voice didn't matter. Annie feared the barn would come back. Michael, too young to write, whispered his fear to Clara, who wrote it for him, scared of being hungry. When every fear was documented, Evan held up the paper. These are real. They matter. But here's what we're going to do. Every time one of these fears shows up, in nightmares, in worry, in the middle of the day, we're going to name it out loud. We're going to say, I'm feeling my fear of abandonment, or I'm scared about being hungry. And then we're going to fight it together. How? Thomas asked. By proving it wrong. Every single day. By showing up for each other. By keeping our promises. By being the kind of family that doesn't run when things get hard. It became their practice. When Ruth started compulsively organizing in the middle of the night, Clara would find her and say, You're feeling your fear, but the house won't fall apart if the dishes aren't perfect. When Peter pushed himself too hard at chores, Evan would pull him aside and remind him, Your worth isn't in how much you can lift. You're valuable just for being here. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, the fears lost their edge. The nightmares didn't stop, but they came less frequently. The anxiety didn't vanish, but it became something they could name and manage rather than something that controlled them. 6 weeks after the hearing, Adelaide arrived for lessons and found the children arranged in the schoolroom with slates and primers, but also with something new: confidence. They raised their hands eagerly. They asked questions without fear of mockery. They made mistakes and laughed instead of cowering. After the lesson, Adelaide pulled Evan aside. "They're ready." "Ready for what?" "For school. Real school in town. They've caught up enough that they won't be lost, and more importantly, they've healed enough to handle being around other children." Evan's first instinct was to refuse, to keep them close where he could protect them, but he saw the wisdom in her words. "When?" "Next week, start of the fall term. I'll introduce them to the class, make sure the other children understand they're to be welcomed. And if they're not? If the town kids are cruel?" Adelaide's expression hardened. "Then those children will answer to me. But Evan, you can't protect them from every hard thing. Part of healing is learning they can face difficulty and survive it." He knew she was right, hated it, but knew it. That evening, he told the children about school. The reactions were mixed: excitement from some, terror from others. Clara's face went carefully blank, which Evan had learned meant she was feeling too much to show any of it. "What if they hate us?" she asked quietly after the others had scattered to evening chores. "Some might. People fear what they don't understand, and your story is, it's a lot. So we just accept being hated?" "No. You walk in there with your head high, knowing your worth has nothing to do with their opinion. You've survived things those kids can't imagine. Their judgment doesn't get to define you." Easy to say. Didn't say it was easy. Said it was true. The first day of school arrived with autumn beginning to paint the cottonwoods gold. Evan drove all 9 children into town in the wagon, their faces scrubbed clean, their clothes carefully mended, their lunch pails packed with sandwiches and apples. They were silent during the ride, fear and anticipation warring on their faces. The schoolhouse sat at the edge of town, a white building with a bell tower and windows that gleamed in the morning sun. Other children were already arriving, clean, confident children from established families who'd never known hunger or abandonment. They stared as Evan's wagon pulled up. Whispers started immediately. Adelaide met them at the door, her expression warm but firm. "Good morning, Cole family." The words, Cole family, settled something in Evan's chest. That's what they were now. Not orphans, not charity cases. Family. The children filed inside, and Evan watched through the window as Adelaide introduced them to the class. He couldn't hear the words, but he saw the other children's faces. Curiosity, some sympathy, a few expressions of disdain that made his hands clench. Clara caught his eye through the window and gave him a small nod. "I've got this," the gesture said. "We've got this." Evan climbed back into the wagon and forced himself to drive away. The day crawled by. He tried to work, to focus on ranch tasks, but his mind kept drifting to the schoolhouse, to 9 children navigating a world that hadn't been kind to them. When the time finally came to collect them, he arrived early, the wagon waiting as children poured out of the building. His 9 emerged together, a unified group, and Evan's heart unclenched slightly. They were all there, all intact. But as they climbed into the wagon, he saw the signs. Ruth's 2 bright eyes, Thomas's hunched shoulders, Clara's rigid jaw. He waited until they were away from town before asking, "How was it?" Silence. Then Ruth spoke, her voice tight. "A girl named Margaret said we were dirty orphans who probably had lice. She told everyone not to sit near us." Evan's hands tightened on the reins. "What did you do?" "Miss Winters heard her, made her apologize in front of everyone." Ruth's voice carried a note of satisfaction. "Then she assigned Margaret to be my partner for reading. Margaret looked like she wanted to die." Despite everything, Evan smiled. "That sounds like Miss Winters." "Some of the kids were nice, though," Peter offered. "A boy named James asked if I wanted to play baseball at lunch. Said I threw pretty good. And a girl named Sarah let me borrow her extra pencil when mine broke," Lily added quietly. The stories tumbled out, some painful, some hopeful, all part of learning to exist in a world that was neither all good nor all bad, but complicated and human and real. "Tomorrow will be easier," Evan said as the ranch came into view, "and the day after that easier still. Eventually it'll just be normal." "I don't know if I want it to be normal," Clara said. "Normal is what regular kids have. We're not regular." "No," Evan agreed. "You're better. You're survivors, and that makes you extraordinary." The weeks that followed established a rhythm. School 5 days a week, where the children slowly earned acceptance through persistence and Miss Winter's unwavering support. Ranch work in the evenings and weekends, where they learned the satisfaction of labor that fed and sustained. Sundays reserved for rest and each other, long meals, shared stories, the slow construction of family traditions that belonged only to them. Not everything was smooth. Thomas still had nightmares. Ruth still organized compulsively when anxious. The twins still communicated in their private language when overwhelmed. But the sharp edges of trauma began to soften, worn down by safety and routine and the relentless presence of someone who didn't leave. 3 months after the hearing, Marshal Cord rode out to the ranch with news. District Attorney prosecuted Silas Brennan, charged him with 9 counts of child endangerment and attempted negligent homicide. Evan had been expecting this, but hearing it still sent ice through his veins. "When's the trial?" "There won't be one. Brennan took a plea deal. 20 years in territorial prison." 20 years. It should have felt like victory, should have felt like justice. Instead, Evan just felt tired. "The children don't have to testify again?" he asked. "No, the plea means it's done. He's going away, and he won't be eligible for early release." "Does Clara know?" "Thought you'd want to tell her yourself." Evan found her in the garden, pulling weeds with the focused intensity she brought to everything. He sat down on the ground beside her, dirt be damned. "Your uncle took a plea deal. He's going to prison for 20 years. Clara's hand stilled. She didn't look up, didn't speak, just kept staring at the tomato plant in front of her. "Clara?" When she finally raised her face, tears were streaming down her cheeks. "I thought I'd feel happy or relieved, but I just feel sad." Sad for him? Sad for what could have been. If he'd been different, been better, we could have been a real family. Me and him and all the others, we could have had something good. Evan's throat tightened. "Yeah, you could have. And the fact that you're mourning that possibility instead of celebrating his punishment, that shows you're a better person than he ever was. I don't want to be better. I want to not care." "I know, but you do care. That's what makes you who you are." She cried then, deep wrenching sobs for a family that never was, for an uncle who chose cruelty over kindness, for the children they'd been before the barn. Evan held her while she grieved, and when she was done, she wiped her face on her sleeve and went back to weeding. "Is it over now?" she asked. "Really over?" "The legal part is. The healing part, that takes longer, but yeah. He can't hurt you anymore." "Good." She pulled a particularly stubborn weed free and tossed it aside. "Because I'm tired of him taking up space in my head. I want to think about other things." "Like what?" A small smile touched her face. "Like whether we should plant pumpkins next year, and whether the twins will ever stop finishing each other's sentences, and if maybe, someday, I could learn to ride a horse." Evan's chest filled with something that felt like hope wrapped in gratitude. "I think we can arrange the horse thing, and definitely the pumpkins." They worked side by side until the dinner bell rang. Ruth's innovation, a piece of iron hung from the porch that she struck with a spoon to call everyone in. It was becoming one of Evan's favorite sounds, the signal that his family was gathering, that another day had passed with everyone safe and accounted for. That night after dinner, Evan stood in the doorway watching the organized chaos of bedtime routines, Peter helping the twins with their nightshirts, Ruth arranging everyone's shoes in perfect rows, Clara reading to the younger ones from a book Adelaide had lent them, Annie already asleep, thumb in mouth, clutching her faceless doll. This was what family looked like, he thought. Not perfect, not quiet, but full of life and noise and love that showed up in 1,000 small actions. The 6-month review hearing arrived on a cold November morning. The children were calmer this time, confident in what Evan had built, secure in the knowledge that Judge Cartwright had seen them, had heard them, had ruled in their favor once before. The courtroom was less crowded this time. No Silas, no opposing lawyer, just Evan and the children and Adelaide and Marshall Cord as witnesses to what had been accomplished. Judge Cartwright reviewed the reports Adelaide had submitted about educational progress, examined the doctor's records showing improved health across all 9 children, read Marshall Cord's statement about the ranch's stability and Evan's character. Then he called Clara to the stand. She walked up with confidence this time. No trembling, no fear. Just a girl who'd learned her worth and wasn't afraid to claim it. "Clara," the judge said kindly, "6 months ago, I granted temporary custody to Mr. Cole. How has that been?" "Good, Your Honor. Really good." "Can you elaborate?" Clara thought for a moment. "Before, I was always scared. Scared of being hungry, of being hurt, of someone leaving or dying or deciding we weren't worth the trouble. Now I still get scared sometimes, but it's different. It's normal scared, like being nervous about school or worried about messing up chores. Not scared of dying. That's a big difference." "Do you feel like Mr. Cole is your family now?" "Yes, sir. He's not perfect. He burns breakfast sometimes, and he doesn't always know what to do when we're upset. But he shows up every single day, and that's what matters." Judge Cartwright smiled, a rare, genuine expression. "Thank you, Clara. You may step down." He didn't call any other children, didn't ask for more testimony, just shuffled his papers, made a few notes, and looked up at Evan. "Mr. Cole, 6 months ago I took a chance on you, an unconventional chance on an unconventional family. I'm pleased to say that chance paid off. These children are thriving in your care. Therefore, I'm making your guardianship permanent. All 9 children are legally and permanently in your custody, with full parental rights and responsibilities." The gavel came down, and this time the sound carried finality. Not temporary, not provisional, permanent. The children erupted in cheers. Even the court reporter was smiling. Adelaide dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Marshall Cord shook Evan's hand with a grip that said, "Well done," without words. And Evan stood there with 9 children wrapping themselves around him like they could merge into one being, and felt the weight of what he'd been given settle over his shoulders like a mantle he'd earned the right to wear. They were his. Fully, legally, permanently his. And he was theirs. The ride home was celebratory, the children singing songs Miss Winters had taught them, their voices carrying across the prairie like a declaration of joy. When the ranch came into view, Evan saw it through new eyes. Not just property, but legacy. Something he could pass down to children who'd never expected to inherit anything but pain. That evening, he gathered them all in the main room. "I want to talk about something important, about names." 9 faces turned toward him, curious and attentive. "Right now, most of you have different last names, names from families that are gone or that failed you. And Clara's got Brennan, he paused, which connects her to someone who hurt her." Clara's hand went to her throat. "So here's what I'm proposing," Evan continued. "I'm officially adopting all of you, not just guardianship, but adoption, which means you'd all take the name Cole, if you want it. You'd be Clara Cole, Thomas Cole, Ruth Cole, all the way down to Michael Cole. You'd be brothers and sisters not just in practice, but in name." Silence fell, heavy with the weight of what he was offering. "We don't have to decide tonight," Evan said quickly. "This is a big thing. You should think about it. Talk about it among yourselves. I just wanted you to know it's an option." "I don't need to think about it," Clara said immediately. "I want it. I want to be Clara Cole. I never want to hear the name Brennan attached to me again." "Me too," Ruth said. "Cole sounds strong." "I like it," Peter added. "It sounds like family." One by one, they agreed. Even the youngest ones, who barely understood what they were choosing, nodded enthusiastically because the older ones were excited. Evan felt his throat close up. "All right then. I'll start the paperwork tomorrow. By Christmas, you'll all be Coles. Officially and forever." That night, long after the children were asleep, Evan sat at the kitchen table with a pen and paper, writing out 9 names. Clara Margaret Cole, Thomas William Cole, Ruth Ann Cole, Peter James Cole, Jacob and Samuel Robert Cole, Lily Grace Cole, Annie Rose Cole, Michael Thomas Cole. He said them aloud, testing how they sounded, and felt rightness settle in his bones. These were his children. This was his family, and nothing, not law, not blood, not history, would ever change that again. Winter arrived in earnest, bringing snow that turned the ranch into something from a storybook. The children had never seen snow before. Not like this, not soft and clean and safe. They built misshapen snowmen, had epic snowball fights, made snow angels until they were soaked through and shivering. Evan taught them to appreciate the quieter beauty too, the way moonlight turns snow blue, the perfect silence after a fresh snowfall, the tracks animals left telling stories about their midnight journeys. Christmas came, and Evan had saved for months to make it special. Small gifts for each child, a new doll for Lily with a carefully embroidered face, a baseball for Peter, hair ribbons for the girls, a carved horse for Thomas, matching pocket knives for the twins, nothing extravagant but chosen with care, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Christmas morning, the children woke to find their gifts arranged around a small pine tree Evan had cut from the back property. Their faces, joy and wonder, and the slow realization that they were children who got Christmas now, made every penny spent worth it. "This is the best day of my life," Annie declared, clutching her new rag doll to her chest. "Mine too," Thomas agreed. Clara met Evan's eyes across the chaos of wrapping paper and excited children. "Thank you," she mouthed. He nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. That afternoon, Adelaide arrived with a basket of cookies and news. "The town's organizing a New Year's celebration, dance and dinner at the church hall. I think you should bring the children." Evan's first instinct was to refuse, to keep them close and protected. But he saw the hope in their faces, the desire to be part of something normal and good. "We'll be there," he said. New Year's Eve arrived exactly 1 year after the night Evan had found them. He didn't mention the anniversary, didn't want to mar their excitement with painful memories. But as they dressed for the celebration, he found Clara standing in front of the mirror, her face thoughtful. "1 year ago I was dying in a barn," she said quietly. "I was watching the others get weaker, and I was trying to figure out how to tell them it was okay to let go, that dying wasn't so bad if we did it together." Evan stood beside her, their reflections side by side in the mirror. "And now? Now I'm going to a dance. I've got a new dress. Well, new to me, and a family and a future I never thought I'd have." She turned to face him. "How did we get from there to here?" "One day at a time. One choice at a time. You chose to survive. I chose to help you. And we just kept choosing over and over until surviving turned into living." She hugged him then, hard and fierce, and full of everything words couldn't hold. "I love you, Pa." The word hit him like a lightning strike. Pa. Not Evan. Pa. "I love you too, Clara. All of you. More than I knew I could love anything." They arrived at the church hall to find it transformed with lanterns and decorations, tables laden with food, a small group of musicians tuning their instruments. The townspeople who'd once whispered and stared now greeted them warmly. Margaret, the girl who'd been cruel that first day of school, approached Ruth shyly. "I'm sorry," she said, "for how I was. You're actually really smart and nice." Ruth considered this, then nodded. "Thank you. You're not bad either once you stop being mean." It wasn't effusive forgiveness, but it was enough. The girls drifted off together, talking about school and books and ordinary things. The evening unfolded in music and laughter and food. Evan danced with each of his daughters in turn, their small hands in his, their faces glowing with joy. He watched his sons integrate into groups of boys, holding their own, proving themselves worthy of acceptance. As midnight approached, the music paused. The preacher called everyone together for a prayer and blessing for the new year. Evan gathered his children close, all 9 of them pressed around him, and listened as the preacher spoke about new beginnings and second chances and the grace of unexpected blessings. When the clock struck midnight, fireworks burst over the town, the same fireworks that had echoed in the distance while 9 children died in a barn. But this year, those children were standing under an open sky, safe and warm and surrounded by people who cared, watching beauty explode overhead with wonder in their eyes. Claire slipped her hand into Evan's and squeezed. "We made it." "We did." "What do you think this year will bring?" Evan looked at his family. Imperfect, complicated, beautiful in ways that had nothing to do with appearances and everything to do with what they'd overcome together. I think it'll bring whatever comes, and we'll face it the same way we faced everything else, together. The fireworks continued, painting the sky in gold and silver and blue. The children oohed and awed, pointing out their favorites, arguing good-naturedly about which colors were best. They were just children now, allowed to be young and carefree and unburdened by survival. And Evan Cole, the man who'd thought his capacity for love had died with his first family, stood surrounded by proof that the heart could always make room for more. That healing wasn't about forgetting pain, but about building something strong enough to hold both the grief and the joy. As the last firework faded, they walked back to the wagon together, tired and happy and whole. The ride home was quieter than the ride there, exhaustion settling over them like a blanket. By the time they reached the ranch, the younger ones were already asleep. Evan carried them inside one by one, settling them into beds, tucking blankets around shoulders, pressing kisses to foreheads. Clara helped with the littlest ones, her movements practiced and sure. When every child was settled, when the house had fallen into the peaceful breathing of sleep, Evan stood in the doorway one last time, taking it all in. This was what he'd built. Not a perfect life, but a real one. Not a family without scars, but a family that wore those scars as proof of what they'd survived and overcome. He thought about the man he'd been a year ago, hollow, isolated, existing rather than living. That man was gone, burned away by the heat of purpose and the slow, steady work of learning to love again. He thought about 9 children left to die, their cries carried on hot summer air, their bodies shutting down, their hope almost extinguished. And he looked at those same 9 children now, sleeping peacefully, growing strong, building futures that stretched ahead of them bright with possibility, from death to life, from abandonment to belonging. From 9 orphans nobody wanted to 9 children who'd found their way home. Evan closed the door softly and walked out onto the porch, looking up at stars that wheeled overhead the same way they had that New Year's Eve when everything changed. The rifle still leaned against the wall, but he no longer needed it for protection. Just habit now, just history. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called. The wind whispered through the cottonwoods. The ranch settled into sleep around him, full of life and love and the quiet certainty of tomorrow. Evan Cole had spent a decade running from the pain of loss, building walls so high nothing could reach him. And then 9 children had crashed through those walls, forcing him to feel again, to hope again, to believe that sometimes the things that break us open are the same things that let the light back in. He'd saved them that night in the barn. But the truth, the deep, abiding truth he was only now beginning to understand, was that they'd saved him right back. From loneliness, from emptiness, from a life half-lived and barely felt. They'd saved him by giving him purpose, by teaching him that love wasn't something you fell into and hoped stayed gentle, but something you chose every day even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. By showing him that family wasn't about blood or biology, but about showing up, keeping promises, and refusing to quit when things got difficult. He stayed on the porch until the eastern sky began to lighten, the first hints of dawn touching the horizon. A new year. A new day. A new life built from the ashes of old pain and new hope. Inside, 9 children slept. Clara and Thomas and Ruth and Peter and Jacob and Samuel and Lily and Annie and Michael. 9 children who'd been thrown away by a world that didn't see their value. 9 children who'd found a home with a man who'd forgotten how to believe in second chances. 9 children who were now and forever Cole. His children. His family. His reason for everything. As the sun rose over Wyoming, painting the snow-covered land in shades of gold and pink, Evan Cole smiled and whispered into the morning air a promise he intended to keep for the rest of his life. I've got you, all of you, and I'm never letting go. The wind carried his words across the prairie, scattering them like seeds that would take root and grow into years of love and laughter, and the sometimes messy, always beautiful work of being a family. And in that moment, standing on the porch of his ranch with 9 children sleeping safe inside, Evan understood that this imperfect, hard-won, chosen family was exactly what redemption looked like. Not grand or dramatic, not perfect or painless, just real, just present. Just love that showed up every day and refused to quit. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.